Sounds good. Okay, well, we'll get going here. It's great to have everybody here this morning. I'll begin by thanking Reuters Events Pharma for prioritizing a really important conversation today. And it really is, the hope is that it'll be a conversation. So we're looking forward to hearing from all of you in the Q&A and the chat. The goal was to bring together a group of operators who can speak from direct experience as to what it'll take to change the paradigm of minority participation in clinical trials, access to that opportunity. In the interest of brevity, so we can focus on the discussion, I'll provide some brief intros of our accomplished panelists and we'll jump right into it. And again, the best webinars are interactive, so please stay with us and share your own experiences. I'll start with Kelly McKee. Kelly is an expert in patient recruitment and engagement. She's held leadership positions at Merck, Lilly, and Vertex Pharmaceuticals. She's current Senior Director, Patient Registries and Recruitment at Medidata Solutions. Hi, Kelly. Next up is Elizabeth George. Elizabeth is a director on the Clinical Trials Diversity Program at GSK. It's a cross-enterprise team focused on delivering strategies and solutions to ensure science guides the selection of clinical trial participants at GSK and reflects those representative of the disease. Hi, Elizabeth. Next up is Meima Karmo. Meima is an entrepreneur, strategist, publisher of Bliss Magazine, breast cancer survivor, and most importantly for this discussion, the founder and CEO of the patient engagement nonprofit Tiger Lily Foundation, which focuses on grassroots education and development for health literacy and advocacy. Morning, Meima.
Morning.
Next is Kunal Patel. Kunal is a physician scientist. He has specialization in tropical medicine. He's also the medical director at IHEED. It's an organization directed to fostering and supporting innovation in health education globally. In that role, he served as a field-based lead in research and advocacy across IHEED's health network. And for those of you who haven't met me before, I'm Irfan Khan. I'm a cardiologist, principal investigator, and founder and CEO of Circuit Clinical, which is an integrated research organization improving access to clinical trials through our patient platform, Trial Scout, and by operationalizing community health systems to provide clinical research as a care option. Good morning and afternoon, everybody. Great to be with you. And again, we'll just remind you one more time, please send in your questions as we go along. I think the webinar will be so much better for your participation. So with that said, we'll jump right into it. And I think the place we want to really start is with take a bearing and take a look at the map. So how did we get to here? Where are we? How did we get here? Before we get into where do we go from here? So, Kunal, if you wouldn't mind giving us some historical context for this issue.
Sure. I mean, even before we even begin going into history, I mean, everyone I think is probably very aware of the current climate and the conversations and discussions that are happening around what we in Europe would call the BAME community or the BAME, or Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, and their access to healthcare, access to trials, and so on. And of course, at a very high level, this is ultimately very determined by vast, debatable, difficult social issues that we face in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere. But if we're thinking about clinical trials, I think a good place to start is also the legacy trials has had on these communities. And something to think about there is that basically a good example would be where I teach master's students right now about ethics and current research and past research and what we need to do going forward for better clinical trials and access, is that the legacy that's been left by previous trials that have resulted in what we call ethical dumping or ethics dumping, where trials have occurred in areas such as India, the west of the continent of South America, North Africa, and in other countries, where these communities have strong networks and family and friends and word spread fast. When your trials go wrong or are found to be unethical in these regions, it has a long-lasting legacy effect. And this is one of the many multiple factors that can affect engagement and access to trials. And a good example we use with our students is actually a very recent one, which was a decade-long trial on cervical smear testing in Mumbai in India. And what they actually found was that when they looked at the trial very closely, was that the control group weren't offered any treatment, even though they were screened for cervical cancer. And there were plenty of other problems with the trial, but this was run by the National Cancer Institute in the US. And it has ultimately resulted in a massive legacy in India, where a large group of Asian trials do occur, mistrusting the system because a trial that long occurred and people were either not treated for being screened for cervical cancer in a large trial because they were considered part of a control group. And that legacy we feel in Europe amongst Asian communities here, and no doubt it's felt in North America as well. And that's a very good example of where ethics dumping has occurred, where trials abroad have had an impact within these communities, because especially if you're a member of these communities, the networks are strong, and the network and word spreads, and this ultimately can affect a lot of the issues and the barriers that you're facing in terms of clinical trial recruitment.
That was very, very interesting, Kunal, and very timely. And that phrase, ethical dumping, is fascinating, because that legacy exists on this side of the Atlantic as well. I think it would be we'd be remiss if we didn't put this into the context of the really the move for social justice that's I believe really helped the industry, our industry, shine a light on this issue and say we recognize it's a problem and we'd like to get better. You have CEOs of major corporations, but I think you look at the legacy of things like Tuskegee and really the disenfranchisement that we've seen around Henrietta Lacks and her estate regarding clinical research there. Those are issues on this side that I think equally resonate well, and I would agree that those networks are very tight. I'd love to throw it over to Mayma and Kelly and Elizabeth and get some thoughts on that side of things in terms of where do we go from here, and what does that legacy look like? And Mayma, if you'd like to speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that Kunal spoke to a lot of things that were important. I think there are access issues, financial, there are things that are practical issues that are barriers, like, leaving work, daycare, there's fear of adverse reactions, there's medical mistrust. But I think for a long time, people have they've not shined the light on the racial injustices that people of color in this country face. And I think that lack of understanding the trauma that comes around, racial abuse, racial harm, feeling safe, as a Black woman that lives in this country, even leaving my house in my community, I'm always aware of where I'm going, how I'm behaving, what I'm doing. And as you look at how people of color have been treated over many, many years, that history and that pain body is embedded in our culture of not trusting the medical community. Henrietta Lacks and Tuskegee were great examples of how we have been disenfranchised. And so I think it's the time now is to really, the practical things to address are important, but then there's the basis of the foundation from where that comes from, and that the trauma has to be addressed as well. So there should be money being invested in the financial support for people who are going to trials. When you leave your job to go to a trial, and you have to go back and forth, there's that travel time, there's daycare, there's leaving your hourly wage job to go. Those things are important, but also important is the trust. And people of color aren't often asked to be in trials. I'm a 14-year TNBC survivor. I've never once been asked about trials in my entire 14-year journey with cancer, and I am highly educated and aware. So imagine the person who's living in a rural community who is less educated. They don't know where to even start. So,
Kelly, and Elizabeth, would you like to provide sort of, that was a great look at what it's like to be on the patient side of this and the advocacy side of it. I know that there's great, smart people working on this with resources on the sponsor side. I'd love to hear how it looks, how the challenge looks from the sponsor side.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a multifactorial issue for sure. We've certainly heard about the historical perspective of how we've gotten here, and that's absolutely, true in many instances. I'd like to also just talk about a couple of instances from a sponsor perspective. So sponsors, there is a reluctance to work with research naive sites. There's a tendency to go with the larger research institutions because they have the experience of working with clinical trials. So that is a barrier that needs to be overcome. And then, from a site perspective, a lot of the smaller sites don't necessarily have the infrastructure to support the specific needs of a clinical trial, and those are also issues that need to be looked at as part of the solution as we go forward.
Kelly, I'd love to get the recruitment and engagement side of this as well.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I do think it's important to note what has happened in the past, but it's also really important that we take that experience and we make things better. So all of us really need to make sure that more people are aware of clinical trials and what they really are, and celebrate the accomplishments that clinical trial participants bring to making new medicines possible. Every new medicine would not be on our shelves without the participation of clinical trial patients. And so we need to do a better job of that. We need to focus on celebrating the people that make new medicines possible. And we need to make it easier for people to participate. And then we also need to make those experiences really good. And so if we, take small but very meaningful steps, we can absolutely get there. And understanding that we're not going to be able to solve the problems that we face without the participation of literally tens of thousands of people.
That's a nice.
Can I add to what they both just said? So there are about $1.3 trillion that are spent in pharma that are revenue-wise coming into pharma companies. The Black community spends $1.2 trillion on consumer goods. Of that, 90% of that dollar is spent on beauty products. Before we began this conversation, we were talking about this, and for me, the concern is if the money's coming into pharma, and Black people are spending almost the same kind of money on skincare products and hair care products, how are we in corporate America investing our marketing, our service, our messaging to Black communities in terms of what's important to them? So if we can market to them in a way that they can spend $1.2 trillion in products that won't save their lives, how can we change our investment in ways that matter for their healthcare and clinical trials? So to your point, Elizabeth, smaller communities may have smaller hospitals and lower, less resources. How do we bring the big hospital center resources to the small communities? It's all about money. And so I think it's really about changing how we're thinking about where the money's going as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to just add to that a little bit. So I think that historically, sponsors have gone to sites that have experience in clinical trials, and those are really the large academic medical centers, right? Who are full of really, really, really bright people doing really great research. But as we need to expand our population base to include a greater diversity of people, it's really important that we expand to those underserved communities and go to doctors that may not necessarily have that clinical trial experience. There are some great companies now who are helping out with that, particularly IROs or integrated research organizations, who actually take the burden off of the doctors so that they can provide care to their patients, and they take care of everything else on the side, right? And Irfan, I know you can talk a lot about this. But we need to start thinking of these things creatively and not be held back by the way we always did things, because the way we always did things just isn't going to work.
It's not working.
Yeah, but I will say that the fact that we're having the conversation, the fact that there's this many attendees is a really good sign. And I'm watching we'll get to some of the comments being made in the Q&A, which are fascinating as well. It's probably worth just beginning with, why should we care? It's clear that every one of these panelists, including myself, care about it, and that the audience does as well. They've made time for this. But from a broader perspective, it would be great to get everybody's kind of one-line thought as to why we think this is an important problem to solve. Kunal, do you want to start?
I could probably bring it to more recent context. Obviously, in one line, I'll struggle, but I'll try my best. Basically, if we're able to tackle health issues, particularly in the BME community, globally, the global burden of disease will drop, because unfortunately, and if we can tackle that right, and that will be via providing better treatment options via clinical trials, that would be very important. And I won't expand on it, but a very good point to think about this is currently what's happening with COVID, and the trials that are going on there. But also what we're seeing with evidence within Europe, certainly, is that if you are of a Black, Asian, and minority ethnic background, you're more at risk of the disease. So we need to definitely be focusing on these groups a lot more to help reduce global burden of disease.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, can I add to that? So absolutely, Kunal, to your point, I mean, it's not just in Asia, in Europe, but it's also in the US that COVID-19 has really put a spotlight, on the disproportionate burden of the disease that we're seeing in certain ethnic minority communities. And it's really, underlining the urgency of making sure that we have adequate representation of those communities in any kind of COVID-19 research that's happening, so that we have safe and effective treatments for everybody.
That's great. Kelly, just, why is this important now?
Yeah, so I really believe that there are more people than not who want to solve the health crises that we face. And we need to make it easy for these individuals to participate in clinical trials and say, yes, I want to be part of the solution. And so what we really need to do is make it easier to participate in clinical trials and ensure that participation is a really good experience. And when we do that and we bring together these groups of educated, informed, and empowered individuals who are research ready, we're going to be able to see this just take off. And so I really just urge everybody to consider participating in a clinical trial, or even just talk about the value of clinical trials amongst your circles and beyond.
Yeah, Kelly and Mayma, I'd love sort of the two perspectives. You know, is the issue that minority communities get asked and don't say yes to research, is that the problem we have to solve, or is the problem that they're not even getting asked?
I think it's both. It's both. I think mostly people are not being asked, and when they're asked, they don't understand what the word clinical is scary. The word trials is scary, right? So even the language we use around those things are scary. And with medical mistrust, there's so much around understanding. So I think, you know, one thing we've done with Tiger Lily is we're going to where patients are. We're going to them and saying, you know, how do we understand what do you understand about clinical trials or not understand? So we talk with them in their language. So first listening is really important. We do a lot of talking, and we're talking, and there's often the person you want to reach is not in the room. So we're always talking amongst ourselves, and we create these solutions and we say, we're going to give the solution to the person. What about you go to the person that you want to reach and you say, how can I talk to you in a way that you'll understand, absorb, and invest in and adhere to? And so when you listen and you build patient-focused solutions, we found that works really well. I think also bringing people of color to the table, like these kind of tables, not just people who are highly educated, but those who are facing disparities in those underserved communities. There are 20 cities that have the highest rate of Black women dying of breast cancer. So we've invested time and money in going to those communities, learning from the advocates, and then co-creating solutions to understanding, to health literacy, asking about financial barriers and so forth. And to Kelly's point, I think, you know, honestly, in the US, George Floyd's murder has brought a light to what people of color are facing. People are now more than ever wanting to find solutions. I've never seen so much interest in clinical trial engagement for the Black community. And so now it's time to change how we're approaching things, find new solutions, and change the legacy of clinical trials for Black people. The legacy could be a lot better. It could be one of empowerment, trust, change, and life-saving treatments.
That's really well said. Kelly?
Yeah, I agree. Words matter. And the way that we talk about clinical trials and the people who participate in them matter. Many of you who know me know that I am on this soapbox to get rid of the word subject, because it just demeans the individuals who make new medicines possible. We need to employ health literacy principles. We need to ensure that people who are participating are fully informed and making an informed choice. That's what an ICF is all about. And it's actually a process, not just the form that you sign. And so when we combine that education, empowerment, etc., with the opportunity to participate, and we make it as easy as possible, right? There's no reason that somebody has to take off 10 days in a year from work to go, you know, drive 30 miles when they could have a telemedicine video visit, for example. We need to make it easier, and then we're gonna, you know, if we do it the right way, we're gonna make a difference. And I think what you're hearing from everybody here is that it's a prime time to really make a difference.
And Irfan, can I just add, you know, one additional piece from a sponsor perspective? One of the things that we are doing, absolutely to the point Mayma raised, you know, and Kelly raised, the engagement is really important. So we have an engagements work stream that is working with the patient, with, you know, the communities, with patient advocacy groups, creating brochures to raise the awareness of clinical trials in the languages, you know, of some of these different communities, because it's important to speak the same language and to bring it down to a simple, easy to understand manner that people can digest, and also to build a trust, you know, to build a trust that there is research that's being done, and it's important, you know, for having that participation from everybody.
Well,
can I interject? So one thing that you said, I think that's really important what you just said, Elizabeth. So patients trust other patients. Every day patients call us and I'm in different groups online. When they go to a doctor and they say, here's what we recommend for you as your protocol and all these things, they come to other patients for advice. And so I think engaging, to your point, Elizabeth, patient advocacy groups that are trusted is really important. I think engaging patient advocacy groups that are Black-led is important. Again, back to the success that we've had is me being a Black patient, being African and African-American by naturalization, we built this army of angels of women that are African-American, some Asian, different brown-skinned, women, but they're trusted by their patients that are coming to us for advice. So when you create literature that's culturally competent, when the person that's giving messaging is someone they trust because he walked the walk, we weren't hired, this is not my job, this is my passion, they trust. And so I think the model is really, how do patient advocacy groups partner with clinical groups and all of you to help us inform you of how the patient wants to be treated and build this trusted partnership. That's so critical.
These comments, this feedback has been great. I'm looking through the comment section with 345 participants in the audience. It's really an amazing set of observations that are coming through. So some of them we've covered. We've talked about. I think between what all of you have shared is that authenticity of the process and of the people delivering the engagement information. That's important. There's been comments raised in the section about the importance of materials in the right language, and I think Elizabeth spoke to that as well. If I were to say that and one of the use cases, and not even the use case, one of the moral imperatives is that a lot of these medicines will be primarily aimed at these minority populations, and so it's imperative that there be minority participation in those trials, and certainly in various rare disease communities and in diseases that have high prevalence like hypertension, mild stomping grounds. That makes a lot of sense. One thing that's been brought up in here a couple of times that makes a lot of sense is, and it leads nicely into our sort of next section, since we've kind of taken a look at where we are and how we got to here. We've talked about why we should care. The meat of this conversation is really about what strategies are there, what solutions have been tried, what lessons have been learned from things that work and things that don't work. And a resounding theme in the comment section is on decentralization. Can putting the trial at home through a decentralized platform, is that solution? Is a hybrid a solution? Is this kind of a passing fad, or is this idea of rethinking what the site is and what the patient experiences in the trial? Has that got a role to play in improving diversity? So Kelly, since I know you've been a pioneer in a lot of this work, I'll start with you.
Yes. Well, I hope the fire is put out. Maybe we can do that here. So yes, I think that clinical trials need to be more about patient and physician choice. We all have different choices every single day of our lives. It's what makes us unique. But we expect that every single clinical trial participant is going to have the same experience. And that just doesn't work. So it doesn't work for the individual who needs to take, for example, like we talked about before, 10 days off from work. Not everybody has an extra 10 days of vacation. And sometimes they'll travel for a long distance only to be seen by the investigator for, 10 minutes and then have a couple of blood draws. If you think about this from a patient's perspective when you're designing a trial, and you only make the visits that must be at the site, right? Like if you're having an MRI or you're having some sort of invasive procedure, that of course can't be done at home. But blood draws can be done at home very easily with a home health nurse. You still have that experience with your physician through the telemedicine video visit. So you really still have that connection, and you're collecting AEs and SAEs. And it's your choice, right? Some people may want to go down to the site for everything. And so I think that if we allow patients to have a say in the type of experience that they want to have in a clinical trial, we're going to make clinical trials an option for more people. And I'm guessing that Irfan had to leave because of the fire alarm. So yeah. I'm happy to just take this on for now. Kunal, maybe you can speak to it from a physician perspective. And what do you think about offering choice in clinical trials?
Well, offering choice is incredibly important. I think it depends on the health system you're in, of course, but it should always be considered almost a treatment option now. It's especially if you think about oncology management and so on. if you've exhausted all the resources you can, your fifth and final option maybe should always be considered a clinical trial. But then, is that physician necessarily going to be aware of that trial? Is there going to be necessarily aware of that access? And one thing I found fascinating, when you look at the evidence and look at some of the systematic reviews and so on around diversity and inclusion in the trial space, the 5 themes in terms of barriers that you see for patients, which are mistrust, lack of comfort with the process, lack of information, issues around time and resource constraints, and we've touched a lot of that in terms of financial burden, transport, time commitment, but also the lack of awareness. Those 5 things actually cross over in all the 4 cadres or groups of people involved in clinical trials. So that's the patients, that's the referring physician, that's the investigators, and it's the study coordinators. All individuals in all those groups face those barriers in some way. So if I'm talking about it from a physician, I'm not the only one who's going to be facing those issues, as well as the patient. And it's also those other 2 groups, as I said, the coordinators and the investigators. So there has to be a shared decision-making process that allows for it to become a treatment option.
And Elizabeth, how easy is it to incorporate choice into protocols? Maybe you can give us a sponsor perspective and the types of things you're thinking about in this era of COVID and then beyond.
Sure. And, I think with COVID-19, a lot of sponsor companies have been forced to move towards decentralized clinical trials. And there's definitely, a thinking that this is going to continue beyond COVID-19. Certainly from a GSK perspective, that is, the support and the endorsement that will continue. Certainly the platform is there. The technology exists to enable that. So it really is a question of adopting it. Some therapeutic areas, it is easier to do than others. For instance, with the blood draws and such, if it is respiratory, there are apps and things that can be done. But with any kind of therapy area, there is always a certain amount that can be done to make it at least a hybrid type of a trial. And, that is something that I think all sponsors need to look at very carefully as they go forward. And it's certainly something that we are doing to see how we might be able to also, from a clinical trial diversity perspective, increase the reach to more diverse participants in our trials.
Kunal, I'm going to go back to something you just said. You said when all other options are exhausted, you should go to clinical trials. Why shouldn't you go to clinical trials first?
I suppose again, I said, it depends on where you're based and the national guidelines or the local guidelines that you must meet in terms of treating a condition. So whether, let's say we think of the geography that I'm in, any sort of ailment that you approach must meet national guidelines or the guidelines that the physician meets in terms of the training colleges and so on. But we do have nationally implemented guidelines for treatment. They must be exhausted because they have been established. And of course, if you can earn a very good physician of a healthcare team, because I want to make it very clear that it's not just physicians, it's nurses and all the allied health professionals who are involved in this. If it's in very early stage of treatment, if you're able to determine that actually the current guidelines are not going to suit this patient, absolutely we can bring the clinical trial option forward. But the big thing is, as I said, those 5 barriers I mentioned, the lack of information and lack of awareness. You ask most physicians or referring physicians, does that option exist? And let's say we think about the US, does it exist if you're based in Florida compared to someone who's based in Maine? I guarantee most of the physicians I know in those geographies will probably say, I don't know. And so that information has to be not only accessible to the patient, but also to that team as well.
So if physicians don't know, is it really incumbent upon the patients to know? And Maima, maybe you can speak to this. How can we make clinical trials an option for more people?
Yeah, I've been dying to jump in. So I want to address something about why aren't patients offered clinical trials earlier? So my best friend passed away almost 5 months ago. And throughout her journey, she had a doctor she trusted. And he just gave her some options for treatment, but he was giving her standardized care. And as a patient advocate who runs a national organization that's now a global organization, I kept saying, why are you giving her a standard of care? Why don't you offer her clinical trials up front and other things? So to our discussion, we have to change our way of thinking. We have to look at the ways we're offering patients options. Don't wait till it's the last resort to offer aggressive options and make the patient, let them make their choice that's best for them. Also, patient education is really important. I find that patients who are educated tend to have often better outcomes. And so getting patients educated earlier is important to us. We spent a lot of our time creating this army of people, angels that are powerful women that know everything about clinical trials, MBC disparities. And so they go to the doctors armed with questions, armed with options. I think also in clinical trial design, it's important to engage patients in the design, because when you get involved it's a relationship you're starting with your provider, with clinicians, researchers. Last year we took 25 women of color to San Antonio Breast. That was the largest number of women of color that have been at San Antonio Breast in the history of the conference for patient advocacy in its 30-something year history. To me, that was shocking. And so, but they got to understand how to talk to scientists, how to ask the right questions, how to become partners in designing treatments, looking at what's working, what's not working. So when you start off getting the patient educated, empowered, informed, and as a partner at the beginning of the process, what you have is a relationship that evolves where the barriers fall apart. You find barriers to lack of access. You create barriers to lack of understanding and literacy. The patient tells you, well, here are my barriers in my everyday life, and you find ways to eliminate the barriers. So I think it's really about, again, looking at how to change what standardized care is and how we deliver patient solutions. Important to give patients the right education, tools, and empowerment, and then get them engaged sooner and throughout the entire process for clinical trial design.
Okay,
And Elizabeth, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add to what Mary said there, is that a lot of that comes across in terms of, and I know the word sounds very specific, but it is around training and education. And I don't mean training and education not only for the health workers, but it's also patients, and involving patients within that training and healthcare education process. So whether ideally it should be a collaborative training process, it should be interprofessional, and health workers should be learning from the patients, but also vice versa within that training process. So there should be formalized training around this, but accessible formalized training.
And also co-created training. So like we're building a training right now that's patients are creating the training for the provider. So we're creating training for researchers and scientists, training for the healthcare provider, nurse navigator. So if it's patient-centric, have the patient help you create the solution that they can send to people that understand what they're, you know what I'm saying? So for the patient, by the patient, to the patient is really important.
Elizabeth, can you talk to us about how you incorporate the patient voice? And then there's some questions about involving IRBs and FDA and in showing how you've incorporated patient voice into clinical trial protocol designs and operations.
Yeah, and I just want to touch on a point, where Mema was talking about the physicians. So one thing we do, one additional approach that we have is that we coach the healthcare practitioners to talk to the patients about clinical trials when they come in during their wellness visits, as part of their healthcare journey, to make it an option for them to be aware of. And with COVID-19, it's been paused, but we do make an effort to reach out to physicians and speak to them at the conferences, when we go to those. But going back to, I guess some of the points of the questions that are coming up in the comments, the FDA is definitely has set an expectation about having the adequate representation of minority groups and the relevant population groups. There was a guidance that came out last year on this very topic, and it is something that is expected. There have been cases where drugs have been taken forward and where there have not been adequate representation of the right population groups. There has been a need for sponsor companies, a requirement from the FDA to do a post-marketing commitment study or a post-marketing requirement study demonstrating the safety and the efficacy, or gathering that additional, benefit risk profile in those relevant population groups. So there's definitely a regulatory expectation that is in place as well.
Great. Now let's talk about access to clinical trials, right? I'm going to move back to that. We all know that there are all of these COVID-19 vaccine trials going on now and some drug trials as well. Do people know how to participate in them? And I'm going to offer my thoughts after everybody else does. Mayma, let's start with you. I think you're on mute.
I pressed the wrong thing, sorry. I don't think patients know where to go for one. And I think even though if they do know, I have had a lot of patients say they don't trust the medical community and they don't want the COVID vaccine, which scares me. So that mistrust is really permeating not just the cancer space, but also, the space around COVID-19. So I think that it's really important to start really talking to patients in a way that helps them understand trials and why they're engaged, why they're important. One of the comments that I saw was by David. He said that we need to change our vernacular around clinical trials and vernacular around minority populations. I think, Black and Latina people, Latinx are among the highest populations in this country, but they're marketed as minorities. So even that and the way we address clinical trials has to change. I think as the words change from clinical to maybe engaging and how this could inform your lifespan and how this could be a legacy building a practice, those things make people more want to adhere than not. So I know I kind of gave a long answer to a short question, but they don't know and they're afraid, and we have to change how we're using the word clinical, the word trial, and the word minority, and the words versus recruitment, maybe engaging in partnership.
Elizabeth, what are your thoughts here? Do you think patients know where to go to participate in COVID trials today?
So that is certainly something that is an area that needs to be worked upon, and not just with COVID-19, but in general with clinical trials. It is clinicaltrials.gov is there as a site, but it's not easy to troll through and figure out what are the active trials that are available. So it is something that we need to do better as an industry to, raise that level of awareness. And like I said, one of the things that we are doing is through the engagement work stream to really work with the different communities and raise that level of awareness around, clinical trials as a whole, and the research that is being done to build the trust. Ahead of time and have those relationships established so that when there is a need to participate in a clinical trial, it isn't looked upon with, a caution or suspicion, but there is that level of trust and engagement that has been built up, so people feel confident and comfortable participating in clinical trials as an option for their healthcare journey.
Thank you. Kunal, what are your thoughts here? Do you think that people know how to participate in a COVID trial if they want to be part of this solution?
Overall, in terms of the globe, I think it's difficult to say yet, but you can say specifically in terms of geography, and I think that's down to a couple of issues, and maybe and issues that we may not be able to necessarily address as individuals or health scientists or health workers or people within the clinical trial industry, because they are social. Knowledge of a trial is also linked very heavily, based on the evidence, to knowledge of what your health access is and having health access itself. So if you have limited access to healthcare, which evidence shows if you're in a BAME group, your access to healthcare is low compared to someone who's not within that group. If you don't have access to a family medicine practitioner, your knowledge and awareness of what is happening in terms of your treatment options is a lot lower. So for example, in Europe, most healthcare is led by a family medicine practitioner or your GP. But if you're a patient in, let's say, California, and you happen to have good health coverage, you're probably going to have 10 doctors on your list: your pediatrician, your OBGYN, your oncologist, your dermatologist. Which one of those do you go to get understanding of what's out there in terms of treatment access? It's difficult. And then if you're on top of that, if you're part of a BME population, you may not have access to that at all. So all of those things play a role in terms of knowledge of the trials, and also having universal health coverage is obviously major. And in regions and countries that do provide universal health access, the awareness is better because it's nationalized. The knowledge is spread via national bodies, but also via, like I said, those key health leaders in the community such as family medicine practitioners?
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is that no, it's not easy to volunteer for a COVID trial, which we need about 30,000 people for each of the phase 3 vaccine trials. If this panel can't even tell us how to do it, how is anybody else? So I'm going to give some 1-800 numbers because I looked it up before our panel. So there are two 1-800 numbers for the vaccine trials that are currently recruiting. And Hannah, maybe we can put these out afterwards, but the first is 1-800-718-1021, and these are US numbers, of course. And the second is 855-663-6762. One of the things that, I'm really working on doing is building these groups of empowered, engaged, and educated individuals who want to participate in clinical trials and raise their hand and then message them about that. So, think about becoming part of that and part of the solution. And I think that, that's going to go a long way. And Irfan is back from the fire. So
Yes,
You survived.
over
a real fire for a change.
Oh my God.
All's well. Sorry
Kelly,
about that. Thanks, Kelly.
Kelly, can I address something? I think one solution that we can start to integrate to work on inclusion in trials is have more Black PIs and more Black doctors and more Black people in STEM. And so one of the things Tiger Lily is working on is getting, I'll be totally honest, getting support for funding support to put STEM in underserved communities, in classrooms, in middle schools, high schools, and colleges. I want to see more Black PIs. It should be standard that every trial should have a advisory committee of people who are underserved, of brown people, Black, Latinx, and so forth. So there are things we can do investing money in these communities by putting in STEM programs, whether it's video-based programs that are virtual with companion curriculum, whether it's partnering with advocacy groups that are Black-led that can help, give people an understanding of what it's like to go into STEM and why it's important for diversity and legacy in life. And then also maybe making it standard again that when we're talking to a lot of partners right now across the spectrum and saying, why don't we offer you an advisory committee of women that are already in these communities that as you build the trial, you're building them with a partner that they're building trust with the patient and they're building trust with the clinician, so that over time leads to less barriers to access to care, to all these things that are problems right now. So it just goes back to rethinking our solutions and being, to Kelly's point earlier, more creative.
And can I just add to that, in terms of the rethink, trials shouldn't be sold to patients. The whole idea of selling something to someone is a barrier in itself. I mean, if you are already part of an ethnic group, you are very likely to be already struggling for many social reasons. And to have something else on top of it seen as a sell is not going to create buy-in. And I'm sorry, I'm using sell and buy-in, and they're not the right terms. And maybe the right term should be is that whoever's involved, the study coordinators, the research and so on, you're trying to elicit behavior change here. You're trying to change people's perceptions of what you're trying to do, trying to improve understanding, and that is all behavior change. And there is some very good evidence out there that shows behavioral change mechanisms such as implementation mapping and so on improve diversity in trial recruitment. So think about that, and I think that's really important.
So maybe the wrong word is not selling, but it's, I mean, everything sells in this world. I'll be honest, Kunal. Like in America, it's all about marketing. I mentioned before the call we got on here, if I mentioned I want to buy an iPhone, I'm going to see iPhone ads all over Facebook when I get on, or my Instagram account. So maybe the wrong word is selling, but it's how you message. Messaging is everything, and building trust. Messaging and marketing, whatever you call it, builds trust. It builds consistency in believing something. So how do we re-language that to message in a way that people are have less barriers, less trust, and how do we get them involved earlier? I know it's a less of an issue in Europe, but it's a big issue in America, and so it's marketing and dollars and how we're targeting people with advertisements.
The point on behavioral change, though, is well taken. I think you're both saying very similar things. And it's interesting because Mayma and I, as Americans, have no problem at all looking at this as a marketing problem. I think there's absolutely a messaging component to this. But you're right. I mean, and most of marketing these days is thinking about behavior, right? How do you teach? How do you put people in a receptive mode to think about something they might already have a preconceived notion about? Mema, I loved your point about the need for more Black and Latinx physicians choosing to provide clinical trials as a care option. We look at the federally qualified health centers as a really wonderful way to accelerate change. Because while I think that starting in med school, starting in residency, really putting that idea in there that this is a really important part of your practice and it'll really change the demographics, it'll take us 15 years for that approach to have an impact. I think while we're doing that, we should also be going to successful physicians who serve these communities and offer them the resources they need to be successful right now in those places. And so that's a really interesting work. I was looking through here, and this isn't limited to one organization. I could name 4 or 5. I think Kelly mentioned before that the Integrated Research Organization model is successful. We have good friends at Javara and Eligo and TrialSpark, and certainly Circuits work. These are all places, companies that are looking to take research and bring it into healthcare spaces. I personally think the federally qualified health centers are fascinating because they serve these populations very selflessly, and they're really focused on providing the same kind of care, same kind of preventive care, same kind of access care. They seem a really good place that if we can help sponsors understand that it's a place that can win if it's resourced properly, that could be another way to impact it. And Elizabeth and Kelly, I'd love some feedback on that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it is certainly, I think it is important to work with the research naive sites with more diverse investigators. What we found is that when we do reach out to the more diverse investigators, they've got a relationship built with the relevant population groups that we are trying to reach. They also have the trust and the relationship already established with the patients. So it absolutely is one part of the solution to look at it and see how we can work with more research naive sites as well as bring in more diverse PIs into clinical trials.
Kelly?
Yeah, I think it's really important that you go where the patients are, right? So if you're looking at a particular disease that is prevalent in group X, and you go to a doctor in that same town who only treats patient Y, that's not going to work. And it does take extra work on the sponsor and the CRO side, right? But there are companies like you spoke about before, the IROs who can help out in that way. It all boils down to this. What we're doing isn't working. We need to change it. I think it's time. I know it's time that we go to the patients to show us how it's done, because we haven't been able to figure out this on our own. And so if we make clinical trials an option for more people, if we make it an easier experience, and we make it a really great experience, I really do believe that we're going to move the needle.
David Saul's got a great comment in here that's just worth sharing, and it goes right to what all of you have been speaking to. So 2 questions. We keep identifying Black and Latinx Americans as minorities, but in the United States, these communities will soon be in the majority in some states. Do we need to change our vernacular? And is there room for mass marketing campaigns focused on these communities to share advances in healthcare, leading to that greater education and understanding? So almost advertising specifically to communities of color, really to sort of say, you are as entitled to clinical research as a care option as anybody else, and you should ask for it. So I think that's an interesting idea all the way around. Mema, I'd love some your take on that.
I've been saying it the whole time. Like, you have to market, 1.3 trillion spent or brought in by pharma every year. Black people spend $1.2 trillion in consumer goods. Of that, 90% spent on beauty products. Again, how are we marketing to these communities? We're not minorities. I think the word has to change, where we are a majority, pretty much almost now. So how do we use different languages, messaging? I know Kunal doesn't like the word marketing, but it's how it works. And we're still friends, Kunal.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah, always. But it's how you address people, and people are people, not just patients. I think it's taking, when science becomes, here's science and here's a human being, there's separation there. I think we have to get back to the soul of our work. We got into our work to touch people, and the words have become the vernacular is now so clinical and so distant to the person, people aren't getting it anymore. So going where they are, getting them engaged at the point of entry, beginning of the trial design process, and explain to them why, if you take part in these trials, they could save your life or someone you love's life as well. And so not promoting it as a clinical trial that I want your genes and all these, there's a mistrust and all this, but help people understand why it could save their life is important. And again, to your point, our friend, messaging, marketing, all of that is how it works in the US. It just does.
And Irfan, may I just quickly
Please.
add to that? You're absolutely right. The numbers are changing in terms of the Hispanic population and Asians even, and so on. But even if the numbers go up, let us not forget, I mean, like you said, can we come up with the answers right now? Probably not on this call, and it's going to take time. But the reason for that being is a very fundamental issue is that even if those populations go up, the majority of people within those populations cover the largest lack of health coverage gap. In other words, they still have a lack of health access to healthcare. And point of access is also the point of access for those who want to recruit into trials. So if people don't have health coverage, if they don't, and especially in these groups, it doesn't matter if the numbers go up, the percentage of people within those groups will still have, there will still be a high percentage of people who do not have health access. You're still going to struggle to bring them in. So the fundamental point is this, is that they need to have improved access first before you could even get to them. And I hate to say that phrase, get to them, because that's not right. And I know we need to be providing equitable healthcare. And if that could be driven alongside the options that you're given, and maybe that's an incentive or something to think about when you think about the costs of recruitment into clinical trials, is the incentive, let's bring you back into the healthcare system because you've been away from it for too long. That is also something to be considered.
That's as good a segue as any for us to slide into this last section, which is really aimed at sort of in the next 2 or 3 minutes. If you could each have one ask of partnerships related to pharma, related to the sponsors who are running the trials, any of it, the health systems, the patients, what would that ask be to make, if we want to look 3 years from now and say, diverse populations average, 5% in clinical trials over the previous 10 years, and we'd like it to be double that, which is still well below where it could be. What would you say needs to change next? Kelly?
I think there are a couple things, so I'm just going to use the commas in my sentence, maybe a semicolon in there. So I think first we have to communicate that this is what we want to do and we're committed to doing it. And we need to communicate that to patients and the public and the investigators and the doctors and everybody. The second is we need to stop being so transactional. It's not just about enrolling a single trial. It's about making clinical trials an option for more people and bringing everything to the left, if you will, right? So if we bring together these groups of empowered, engaged, and educated individuals who want to participate in clinical research, even before trials begin through the use of registries or patient recruitment initiatives, then we're going to be able to really change the way that clinical trials are recruited.
Great. Mema?
People work with, I'll be like Kelly, I'll use my comments very wisely as well, because I was going to cheat the whole time. I can't just give one answer. People follow who they trust. So go to trusted patient advocacy organizations like us, like Tiger Lily. People also go where they are, rather, go to where they work, where they play, where they pray. So going to the community and saying, we're here, we're working with you as a partner is important. Put them at our tables. I mean, oftentimes when I'm at different events, I'm one of the only young women, a Black woman in the room discussing clinical trials. Bring the patient to the table as an equal partner. An equal partnership means investing in their education, in advocacy and empowerment, in understanding how to make the terms culturally literate for them and understandable and digestible. And important also is to address the trauma around clinical trials for Black people.
Kunal?
Okay, I'll try to use less commas and putting more conjunctions if I can. It's still going to be more than one line, but I have to think about, we all have to think about the context right now, which is the pandemic, and access to individuals and communities and groups is a lot more difficult. So we need to think about, okay, what are we coming to do? And that means being online. And what can we do within the virtual and online space? And that all the things we've talked about today, whether it be having champions within the community, so improving diversity within the recruitment sector and the physician sector, removing the snow-capped mountains, as I call them, that can all happen within an online space, because an online space is equitable. Everyone's equal there. And throughout that online space, which we're going to have to use from the get-go right now, and probably for the foreseeable future for at least a year, or maybe even more, you've got to think about, okay, the barriers that I've mentioned, but also that collaborative process of training and learning, of, bringing people into the fold, like a webinar like this today, that provides that access, and that includes bringing grassroots communities, etc., and more, and not so everyone at every position that you possibly can, and a virtual space allows you to do that.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, so thanks, Irfan. I think, like the others, I have a couple of points to talk about from a sponsor perspective. Where we found our successes in having the appropriate and adequate representation of diverse participants in clinical trials, there have been a couple of things. So the first is having a diversity champion on the study really makes a difference. The second is that working with more of these research naive sites and diverse PIs, that also makes a difference. And then finally, at GSK, we have an amazing team of individuals who are passionate about clinical trial diversity that are working across the enterprise, on this effort. But it's also important to have the sponsorship and the commitment from senior leadership. That is really, critical in moving things within a large organization. And our CEO is very supportive of this effort in clinical trial diversity. So from a sponsor perspective, I would say, get a diversity champion on your studies. Make sure that you are working with the diverse PIs and some of the smaller research naive institutions. Work to see how you can build those relationships, provide them with that infrastructure, and then get that sponsorship from senior leadership so that you can actually move things along.
Well, that was terrific, and I think we're on the hour, just a little over it. So I'll sum up. My ask is pretty simple. I think that what we've seen from this group of operators and this fantastic Q&A section is that there are a lot of people who have solutions, who actually have tried things that have worked, that could scale. There's a lot of momentum. And I have definitely never seen the leadership at the sponsor level so motivated to do something real here. So I'm optimistic about this. And the ask is really just from the sponsors themselves, is that I think the solutions are out there. And I think that the key is, yes, it's on the vendors to bring those solutions forward of every kind, both in advocacy and in the space. But I think that this is a window, and I think everyone should seize it as we go along. And again, the solutions raised by the panelists. I want to thank you all. This was a great discussion. I learned a lot, which is always a nice use of an hour, and including surviving a kitchen fire. It's all good. And I want to really thank Reuters Pharma, because this is a big platform for a really important discussion. I'm very thankful to the audience for that great participation. So Hannah, do you want to show us the next event that's coming up here? Yeah, so this is Reuters' next event on December 1st to 4th, which is the Pharma and Patient Summit. And there'll be more information on the website too. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate it all. Have a great day, and let's keep the conversation going, but let's also keep pressing for change.
Thank you.
Great. Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.